Audio lecture for Unit 8, Post-Classical China, Japan, and the Mongols. China in the Middle Ages. The Sui Dynasty in China. In 581, Yang Jian founded the short-lived Sui Dynasty by reuniting China and driving out nomadic invaders that had taken over prior to that time. This was a reunification in the post-classical era. The Sui Dynasty revived Confucianism as civil service exam systems for government positions grew. This is something that had been around in the Han Dynasty period in the classical era of history. Using Confucianism as a basis for the curriculum, students would study Confucian principles and have to take a very difficult exam before they could be considered for a position in the bureaucracy. The Sui dynasty was short-lived indeed. However, they did begin a massive engineering project. The Sui leaders built what was called the Grand Canal. It was 14,000 miles long and it linked the Huang and the Yangtze rivers. This allowed for there to be north-south trade. This canal connected these two rivers, allowing for goods to travel between one river in the north and another river in the south. Most of the rivers in China run from west to east into the Pacific Ocean. And so that's why it was necessary to dig this canal connecting these two rivers. This will increase trade within China. The Grand Canal also allowed southern rice production in the southern part of China and northern millet production in the northern part of China to reinforce each other. Ultimately, this would bring more food to the people in China. Tea and silk production and trade continued to expand due to the Grand Canal as well. In 618, however, rebellions and a failed attempt to conquer Korea led to the end of the Sui dynasty. The Grand Canal project would continue to be worked on and expanded by later dynasties. The Tang Dynasty in China. In 618, Li Yuan, leader of the rebellion, proclaimed himself emperor of the Tang Dynasty. Li Yuan was mixed Chinese and Turkish nomad. He retained Buddhism that had expanded into China during the classical period, and he also retained the strong military organization of Central Asia that he had learned from his Turkish ancestors. Tang leaders relied on Confucian civil service exams once again to fulfill those government positions, but hereditary connections did remain important in the Tang Dynasty as well. Li Yuan and his son Tang Taizong built a vast empire. They managed to conquer Korea, Vietnam, and Tibet. They all became tributary states. The Tang revitalized the Silk Road even more, trading even more silk, paper, and porcelain with Muslims in the Middle East, expanding that trade into the Arab world. The Tang capital of Chang'an was prosperous. It was a city of over 1 million people, and it had Muslim and Byzantine diplomats coming to it to do business and diplomacy, and very many merchants from all over the world will come and do business here as well. A very important city, Chang'an. The equal field system that they utilized saw the Tang emperors redistribute land to the peasants. This weakened the power of the large landowners. What they did basically is take land away from nobility big, large estates, and they instead redistributed land to um, lower class people. The equal field system was designed to make it so every family had land to work on. And ultimately, the amount of land that your family was given depended on how large your family was, how productive the land was, and how much they thought that your family would be able to produce off of that land. The idea was to increase production overall. The equal field system earned the loyalty of the peasants for the Tang Dynasty. Um, they were forced to pay taxes to Tang emperors as payment for their lands, but ultimately they were given an opportunity to make a living again, which they had lost during the end of the classical period after the fall of the Han Dynasty. The Tang era ushered in a golden age as well. Now, we've talked about golden ages before. That means, of course, when you have economic prosperity, you have the wherewithal, the ability, because of that economic prosperity, to launch a golden age, to have, you know, cultural flowering, intellectual activity, etc. And so, this golden age in the Tang era, particularly in poetry, Li Bo was a poet who stressed freedom of spirit, love of nature, while Du Fu, another poet, emphasized social justice and suffering. So, two sides of the same coin, both emphasizing different things, different aspects in Chinese society. The social justice and suffering of Du Fu was, of course, influenced by Buddhism, trying to get away from that suffering and try to ensure social justice. And the Li Bo's freedom of spirit and love of nature had a lot to do with the old ways in China prior to Buddhism coming in. Chinese society consisted of three main classes by this point: gentry, meaning the larger landowners, peasants, ones who worked the lands, as well as merchants. And remember, typically in Chinese society, the peasants are seen as above the merchant class. The gentry included wealthy landowners as well as ones who had earned positions as civil servants in the government. They would work as district leaders, provincial leaders, and of course, directly in the imperial government underneath the emperor. Peasants mainly farmed. The vast majority of the population was were members of the peasant class. Merchants might be rich, but still considered lower than the peasants on the social pecking order because they profited from other people's hard work. The upper class women were even allowed to own land during the Tang Dynasty. They were also allowed to be seen in public and remarry, but marriages were arranged within the social class. So you did not see a lot of marriage between the classes. There will be a very strong empress during the Tang Dynasty who will rule in her own right. Her name is Empress Wu Zhao. She was the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name. She favored Buddhism over Confucian scholars as well. Monks like Zhuangzhang, who traveled to India, ultimately helped to spread Buddhism even deeper in China. Buddhist monasteries grew wealthy and influential, which is kind of ironic when you think about what Buddhism was supposed to be about. Buddhism was about removing suffering by removing desire, and we all can agree that the desire for wealth was one of the biggest things that caused suffering to people throughout the world. How did the Buddhist monasteries grow so wealthy and influential? It was largely by Buddhists who had been wealthy before they became Buddhist, donating their wealth to the monasteries. And initially, the Buddhist monasteries were to use that wealth to help to alleviate the suffering of other people, like charitable organizations, etc. But over time, like we see with many religious organizations in this time period, you do see some corruption in some areas. Not all, but in some. By the 900s, Daoist and Confucian rivals convinced Tang rulers that the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries, were a threat actually to China. The monasteries were destroyed ultimately by later Tang emperors, and Buddhism was weakened as a result. In 907, high taxes among the farmers led to peasant rebellions throughout the Tang Empire, and eventually the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. This will lead to the rise of a new dynasty in China, the Song Dynasty. In 960, the Gurhits people overthrew the Tang, allowing for the rise of the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty never really successfully united all of China like the Tang had, however, and the empire will be much smaller. With the emergence of the rival Liao Dynasty in the other parts of China that had once been under the Tang Dynasty, um, and the invasion of another group of nomads, the Khitan people, the Song eventually moved further south and moved their capital to a new city, Hangzhou, in order to keep their capital from being too close to those rival peoples. The Song also introduced a new strain of rice from Champa in Vietnam. This Champa rice quickly ripened, grew a lot quicker, ripened a lot more quickly, and allowed them to be able to plant two crops for each year. And this, of course, will lead to more food being able to be produced in one year. Remember what we've said before, more food, more people. So, of course, the population will soar during the Song Dynasty with the introduction of this new strain of quick ripening rice. Champa rice also would bring a lot of wealth into China because it could be traded. It was traded on the Grand Canal between North and South China. Of course, it was traded on the Silk Road as well and the Indian Ocean trade routes, making it further west into the other areas of the world, going into the Arabian Peninsula, reaching the Arab trade routes, and then eventually moving into the Mediterranean and making it northward into Europe. The Chinese began building new boats as well to trade. These were called junks. These junks were ships with four sails, a rudder, and they were strong enough to make long distance trips at sea. That rudder was something that the Chinese had invented to make it easier to steer your boats. We've talked about that in earlier units. Uh, you combine that with multiple sails that could be pulled in different directions to capture the wind, and you can steer your ships a lot better, both with the rudder and with the moving sails. This will make it a lot easier for long distance trips at sea. And eventually, this technology will be expanded and shared with others along the trade routes. One of the things that we do see, however, in the Song Dynasty is foot binding of the women. Foot binding became a very common practice for upper class women during this period. It is a painful practice of ultimately wrapping the foot very tightly in cloths and eventually causing the bones to break in the feet and the foot to deform, making it very difficult to walk. Many believe that they did this, especially in the upper class, to keep their women from being able to go very far. They had to remain at home. It was difficult to walk. and they became almost like trophy wives instead. This was a way to limit the power that women had gained in earlier dynasties and once again return them to the home. This is a shoe, a foot binding shoe, that would help maintain that position of the foot. And over time, the small feet, because it will make their foot deform and look smaller because their arch would be so high, and the toes curling under with a pointed toe at the top, became a fashion statement in Chinese culture, especially among the upper classes. The bound feet ultimately became a status symbol. If you were of a wealthy class, um, your feet were bound as a woman. They started the binding of the feet when they were toddlers before they even really walked very much at all. And they would continue the practice throughout their lives. Foot binding reinforced, like I said before, the subordination of women and the confinement to the household. Lower class women, you did not see as much foot binding because they had to work in the fields. So again, the foot binding was a practice that you saw mostly in the wealthy classes, the gentry, the nobles. Now let's talk about medieval Japan or post-classical Japan. Sometimes we use the word medieval when we talk about the post-classical period in Japan because the word medieval really mostly refers to the feudal system that had developed in Western Europe. However, as we will see in Japan, the governing system that developed there during the same time period is very similar to the feudal system in Western Europe. And so therefore we use the terminology that we do in Western Europe, medieval, instead of just post-classical. So let's talk first about the early power in Japan prior to it becoming like medieval governing. Ancient Japan had several rival clans. They were called uji, and they were separated by the mountainous topography. They would eventually only really be united culturally by their language and their religion. This is similar to what we saw like in ancient Greece, with the mountainous topography of the area kept those city-states separate from each other. Even though they were self-governing, autonomous, they had a similar culture and language, religion, etc. Similar situation here in ancient Japan. Not united politically, though they had a similar culture, language, and religion. Shintoism is the traditional religion of Japan, the traditional belief system of Japan. It is an animistic religion reflecting the people's respect for the powers of nature. The symbol that you see there in the water is the symbol for Shintoism. And you can actually see a replica of that particular one in Epcot Center in Japan, in Epcot. I can always bring it back to Disney, folks. Japan was influenced by China through Korea, including being influenced by Chinese Confucianism, by Buddhism that had come into China from India, by Chinese writing. That's why the writing system in Japan, although it's not exactly the same, looks similar to the Chinese writing. And they were also influenced by art and architecture. That's why you see, an image here of a bridge between Korea and Japan, getting information and cultural diffusion from China to Japan. Is that bridge really there? No. But that is where most of the cultural diffusion came from. The contact that the Japanese had with the Koreans, the contact that the Koreans had with the Chinese, especially since the Chinese had taken over Korea several times, brought cultural diffusion into Japan. So the Chinese culture will influence Japan. Here are some illustrations showing you different times that you see um, cultural fusion happening between China and Japan. As early as 858, The Fujiwara family, which we'll talk about later, gains control over the emperor in Japan. In 1159, the capital is burned by warring families, rebuilt in 1192. Shogun in 1192, Shogun's capital has more power than the emperor's, and by 1185, Minamoto destroy Tara, becoming the first shoguns. We'll talk all about that in later slides. But what I really want to point out here are those arrows. You see the arrow up at the top showing introduction of Buddhism to Japan by 552, coming from Korea, and of course it came to Korea from China. And then you also see between 600 and 800 the lower arrow showing Chinese art and government influencing Japan. By around 500 in Japan, the Yamato clan that had claimed territory in the southern half of Japan gained control over many other clans in Japan. And so all those clans that had been separated by the mountainous regions that were all autonomous and governed themselves, half of them, ultimately, half of that land, ended up being controlled by the Yamato clan. So uniting half of Japan under one clan. The Yamato clan eventually became the royal family of Japan. That was the roots of developing a united kingdom of Japan. The emperor was considered a god on earth in early Japanese history. By 607, Emperor Shotoku Taishi sent ambassadors to China to learn about the Tang style of government and culture, so he could better defend Japan if China tried to take over. You see, he recognized how important it was to know your enemy. Even though they borrowed a lot from China, they did not want to be taken over by China. Shotoku's reforms to Japan included limiting the power of the nobility and creating a merit-based system and constitution based on Confucianism for Japan. All taxes were to be paid directly to the imperial government. By limiting the power of the nobility and instead encouraging a merit-based system of who will work in the government based on, of course, Confucian principles, he made sure that those nobles would not be able to challenge him, at least for a while. Buddhism will also spread to Japan, as I said before. Shotoku himself became a Buddhist, and eventually it was synthesized with Shintoism. This is what will create now the most famous kind of Buddhism that there is, Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism ultimately is a combination, if you will, of Buddhism and Shintoism. Taika, the Great Change reforms, Taika reforms, known as Great Change, that's what Taika means in Japanese, ultimately happen and will establish the Grand Council of State and divide Japan into districts based on what Tang China had done. This would be a more efficient way to govern Japan and put special provincial governors over those different areas, the Grand Council of State. And those Taika reforms were designed to try to make the government run more efficiently. Tax collection would be done more efficiently, etc. After Shotoku died, however, in 622, the Fujiwara clan came to power. Though the Yamato emperors ruled in name to the present day. Ultimately, what we see here is one of those noble families, the Fujiwara clan, were able to take advantage of the fact that Shotoku died and his successor was weaker than him, and they would be able ultimately to claim the real power. They would allow for the Yamato emperors to continue to have their title as emperor, but the real power was in the hands of the Fujiwara clan. This will set the basis for the power of feudal Japan. And this is one of the reasons why we refer to it sometimes as medieval Japan and feudal Japan, like we do medieval Europe and feudal Europe. In 710, the Japanese built a capital city called Nara. Nara was modeled after the Tang capital of Chang'an. And in 794, the capital had to be moved to Heian, which is Kyoto today. Let's talk a little bit more about how Japan was ruled under the feudal system. In 1192, Minamoto Yoritomo established the first official Japanese shogunate. A shogunate is a feudal government, and this feudal government lasted in Japan for 700 years. Let's talk a little bit more about that. The emperor, as I said before, remained in name the supreme leader, but ultimately the power was in the hands of the shogun, the office of a shogun. The shogun's immense power was based on his control of the military. Shogun means supreme general of the emperor's army. And so ultimately the power was in the shogun's hand. The Japanese system of feudalism is similar to the European system, though it developed independently, was not influenced by what was going on in Europe. It developed independently on its own. So the feudal society, technically the emperor is still on top, even though he doesn't have any real power to govern. Underneath him is the shogun, the one who holds the real power. Under the shogun are the very powerful families, the big noble families in Japan, and those families are known as the daimyo. Under them, you have the warriors, the samurai. So the samurai are like the knights in Europe. They are knights to the daimyo, who are the nobles in Europe, who then answer to the shogun. And then under the samurai, of course, are the peasants. And then underneath them are the merchants. The emperor reigned, but did not always rule, in other words. The shogun really was the puppeteer, if you will, pulling the strings of governing. The Japanese nobles, like I said before, were called daimyo, and they were given land and protection in return for providing military service to the shogun and thus to the emperor, and also agricultural compensation. So they are the ones in charge of the lands, and the peasants working those lands give them the produce. They make sure that the produce is given through the taxes to the shogun and ultimately to the emperor, but again, in name only. The word daimyo means great name, so like noble name, noble families. Minamoto Yoritomo, the one who created the first shogunate, did not demand oaths of loyalty from the daimyo in exchange for fiefdoms, however. The daimyo were actually a little bit more independent, therefore, than the European vassals or the European lords, nobility. Ultimately, the Japanese feudal system was based on a code of honor called Bushido and on mutual political and social obligations and loyalties. Bushido is very similar to what we saw in Europe with the code of chivalry that the feudal system was based upon. That the knightly code of conduct, of course, which was chivalry, is similar to the Japanese virtues of the code of honor in Bushido. You can see here the different levels of Bushido. integrity, respect, heroic courage, honor, compassion, honesty and sincerity, and duty and loyalty. The daimyos had high social status since they were the nobles, if you will. Each had their own groups of samurai warriors, their knights, if you will, their samurai warriors, who swore loyalty to them. The samurai, the word means to serve, were considered the military servants, and they lived by the Bushido code as well as Confucian ideals of personal honor and loyalty. Samurai who betrayed the code of Bushido were expected to commit seppuku. Seppuku was ritual suicide known as stomach cutting. Stab themselves in the stomach and move the knife around in a certain direction in order to disembowel themselves. Stephen Turnbull wrote a book called Samurai, the World of the Warrior, and he explains it in this way. In the world of the warrior, seppuku was a deed of bravery that was admirable in a samurai who knew he was defeated, disgraced, or mortally wounded. It meant that he could end his days with his transgressions wiped away and with his reputation not merely intact, but actually enhanced. The cutting of the abdomen released the samurai's spirit in the most dramatic fashion, but it was an extremely painful and unpleasant way to die, and sometimes the samurai who was performing the act asked a loyal comrade to cut off his head at the moment of agony. The samurai did not receive fiefs for their service, but instead they were paid fees by their daimyos. So that's a way that it's a little different than the feudal system in Europe. You could consider some comparisons, comparing the differences as well as the similarities between the two systems. Peasants formed the next to lowest social class and worked on the lands of the daimyo. Only merchants were below them. Many Japanese peasants willingly worked the land to avoid having to pay high taxes. If they owned land themselves, they would have to pay taxes. So they would work the land for the daimyo and then receive some of the produce to feed their families with. They had more freedom that this way, however, than European serfs had because they could, in fact, own land, but many of them chose not to, so they would not have to pay the taxes. Women had few rights, again, like we've seen in every other culture, patriarchal society in Japan, much like in China, but they could not inherit land, even though technically they could in China. Now let's talk a little bit about the Mongol Empire. We've been kind of leading up to this for many units. Mongol Eurasia, we call it, because we will see finally a blending of the two. The Mongols actually will extend their control from Asia and then start moving westward to conquer parts of Europe as well, Eurasia. 22% of the Earth's land surface will ultimately be under the Mongol Empire. It will be the largest empire that was ever seen, only being surpassed in the 19th century by the British Empire. The rise of the Mongols. The Mongols were nomadic pastoralists, horsemen and warriors from the central grasslands of Asia. They lived much in the Gobi Desert region. They had lived there for centuries. They had been called by different names. At some point, you see some Huns involved in there, Zhuang Yu involved in there. Ultimately, these pastoral nomads come out of the steppe regions, this wilderness regions, to start conquering other territories. In China first, and then moving westward. We have no kings, and we want none. Among us every man is king. That was a Mongol adage or a Mongol boast, if you will. Well, at least for some time. They will eventually have a king. They will be united under one ruler with Genghis Khan. We'll talk about that. Genghis Khan, which means world emperor, is the one responsible for finally uniting the Mongol clans. And he created a very disciplined army by unifying those clans, breaking the back of the tribal system and unifying them into one great empire. Genghis Khan is said to have said, "Heaven has appointed me to rule all the nations, for hitherto there has been no order upon the steppes." In the early 1200s, under Genghis Khan, the Mongols conquered most of Asia. You see here all the territories that he was able to claim and what years he did so. He moved very quickly, taking over many, many places. The Mongol armies were not large, but they were expert horsemen. One of the reasons they were such expert horsemen was that they had invented the stirrup, the horse stirrup. And they did this so the archers could stand up in the stirrups, steer the animal with their very strong legs while they were shooting arrows at their opponents. They used short bows to make it so they could maneuver around the horse's neck as well. But this made them a formidable foe. The stirrup, important. Mongols embraced military technology of the conquered peoples that they took over. Ultimately, once they take over China, you see that they will borrow gunpowder from them. They will start using that in their warfare as well. They also borrow catapults from the Turks when they come into contact with them and conquer part of the Turkish territory in Persia. The Mongols expanded westward, as I said, also, eventually conquering parts of Eastern Europe. So the part of Asia that spread westward, taking over Eastern Europe, will eventually be known as the Empire of the Golden Horde. By the time we get to the late 1300s, Tamerlane was a Mongol that conquered Persia and Mesopotamia. Now, Tamerlane was actually more of Turkish descent than original Mongol descent, but by that point, by the 1300s, the Mongols had taken over all those Turkish territories, had started intermingling with them, and so the Mongols now were more than just um, um, the same race that they were before. They had intermingled, and ultimately Tamerlane conquered Persia and Mesopotamia, moving the empire even further westward. Tamerlane is actually short for Timur the Lame. He had been injured earlier in his life, which left his leg lame. So, anyways, Tamerlane. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad eventually, ending the Abbasid Dynasty. That Abbasid Dynasty that we talked about back in a previous unit. But many Mongols did convert to Islam once they settled in this region. Probably the most famous of the Mongol emperors will be in 1279, Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was the grandson or great grandson of Genghis Khan, and he established the Mongol dynasty in China. He will rule over that part of the Mongol Empire, and he will establish what is known as the Yuan Dynasty. Kublai Khan said, "Heaven grew weary of the excessive pride of China. I am from the barbaric north." Under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols conquered all of China, Korea, as well as Southeast Asia. In 1271, Kublai Khan launched a naval invasion of Japan. The invasion, however, was unsuccessful because it was destroyed by a monsoon storm. So, the attempt to take over Japan will ultimately fail. Tamerlane, however, back to Tamerlane, will successfully in the 1300s conquer India and establish the Mughal Dynasty. Islam was introduced to India through Tamerlane and his successors. So the northern part of India will ultimately absorb Islam. The southern part of India will remain predominantly Hindu. The expansion of the Mongol Empire can be seen here on this moving map. It happened rather quickly. The largest empire that it had ever existed in the world, and it will remain the largest until eventually surpassed by the British Empire in the 19th century. The Pax Mongolia. Yes, similar to what we heard in a previous unit with the Romans, the Pax Romana, we do see a Pax Mongolia coming out of this unity that we see in Eurasia. Gayuk, who was the third great Khan of the Mongols, said, "All empires from sunrise to sunset have been given to us, and we owe them," meaning they need to rule rightly. The Mongols actually brutally conquered people and destroyed civilizations. But once they were in control of those areas, once control was established, their rule became fairly tolerant. The Mongols were known for their ferocity in battle, so much so that oftentimes they would move into an area and they would tell the people, if you just submit to us, we won't have to destroy you, and you can already accept the benefits of being part of our greater empire. But if you make us conquer you, we'll make you sorry. Goyak said, "The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them in tears, to clap to your bosom their wives and daughters." So they were known for their brutality. But once they took over, you were with them. The Mongols eventually developed a very tolerant rule when it came to religions and customs. They were very tolerant of diverse religions and customs as long as the conquered people paid their annual tribute to the Mongols. Ultimately, if you pay your taxes, we'll let you continue your culture the way you want to. After Genghis Khan died, the empire would be divided up among his sons into political regions called Khanates. You see, in green will be the empire of the Great Khan, which had been the territory that Genghis Khan had started with, and then the other parts. This is why Tamerlane is in charge of part of the Mongol territory, and Kublai Khan in charge of another part. Ultimately, we still consider all of it the Mongol Empire, but there will be 5 different Khanates, kind of Mongol states, as part of that empire. Genghis Khan said, "With heaven's aid, I have conquered for you a huge empire, but my life was far too short to achieve the conquest of the world. That is left to you," he says to his sons and great grandsons. The Khanate of Kipchak had a lasting impact on Russia. Russians called the Mongols the Golden Horde, so that's where that name came from. And ultimately, you will see a blending of Russian culture with the Mongol culture as well. So we've already talked about how Russia adopted a lot from the Byzantine culture, and now they also are adopting a lot from the Mongol culture. So a lot of cultural diffusion right there in Russia as a result. Russia to this day in the East has more Asian influences than it does in the western part of Russia, which is still more Byzantine and European in flavor. The Russia remained a backwards nation for centuries, however, because the Mongols isolated them from the rest of Europe. It's sometimes referred to as the Mongol yoke. And ultimately, Russia will not develop in the same way when it comes to governing structures, etc., as Western Europe will. Mongols ruled China for 150 years, establishing the new capital at Khanbalik, which is modern day Beijing, the capital city to this day. China prospered under the Yuan Dynasty, that was basically the Khanate that had been given to Kublai Khan. Trade and cities will flourish under his reign and his successors. The Yuan, however, relegated Chinese to lower status than Mongols. They did not trust the Chinese. After conquering them, they did not include them as much as they did with other peoples that they conquered. Instead, they elevated the status of merchants because they wanted trade. They continued to expand trade along the Silk Road. And this angered the Confucian scholars. So the merchant class and merchants from foreign lands that came in to do trade with the Mongols, ultimately, many of them would be offered positions to stay in China and offered these positions of power in the Mongol or the Khan's bureaucracy. And this, of course, angered the Confucian scholars. It angered the traditional Chinese. So that toleration that we just talked about was not really extended towards the Chinese because Kublai Khan, who's kind of started this process, didn't really trust the Chinese as much as he did foreigners, actually. The Yuan respected Confucianism. They did not, however, use those civil service exams for selecting their bureaucrats. They promoted Mongols to positions of power and even, like I said, foreigners. For example, Marco Polo, he was an Italian merchant who did trade with the Mongols. He eventually became part of the bureaucracy of Kublai Khan and spent, several years of his life working for Kublai Khan as a bureaucrat. Political stability that was called the Pax Mongolia in the largest empire in history allowed trade between the East and the West to grow. And this facilitation of trade between the East and West, more so than we've ever seen before, will ultimately bring more goods to Western Europe and ultimately bring Western Europe out of those Dark Ages periods. Okay, bringing a lot of new technology and goods and services to them. Jack Weatherford, historian, wrote a book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. He says, the Mongols made no technological breakthroughs, founded no new religions, wrote few books or dramas, and gave the world no new crops or methods of agriculture. Their own craftsmen could not weave cloth, cast metal, make pottery, or even bake bread. They manufactured neither porcelain nor pottery, painted no pictures, and built no buildings. Yet, as their army conquered culture after culture, they collected and passed on all of these skills from one civilization to the next. In other words, the Mongols may not have been big engineers, they might not have been big creators and producers, but they were transmitters. They were transmitters of culture between the East and the West. And had it not been for the Mongols promoting that with conquering these territories, being these transmitters of culture and technology, the East and the West would not have had this blending. The Western Europe would have remained in the Dark Ages, and the world would be very different than it is today. So think of the Mongols as transmitters of culture and technology. Ultimately, when you look at the Mongol Empire, you really see that it really was only used to control the entire length of the Silk Road, making trade safer, rather than launching massive new ways of governing, new ways of technology, new ways of engineering. No, they didn't do that. Ultimately, what they did was they united all parts of these massive trade networks that had been created before, uniting the Silk Road, uniting it with the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and with the Persian territories, and with the Arab world, and eventually moving into Europe. And that, of course, controlling the entire length of the Silk Road makes trade safer. Under the reign of Genghis Khan, all the country from Persia and the land of the Turks enjoyed such peace, that's why we call it a Pax Mongolia, such peace that a man might have journeyed from the land of the sunrise to the land of the sunset with a golden platter upon his head without suffering the least violence from anyone. In other words, the ferocity of the Mongols when it came to their military, that military protected the Silk Road and protected traders on those Silk Roads, ultimately making it safe from piracy, safe from robbers, and trade will be influenced even more because of that safety. Mongol women could even be soldiers. They could own property, be seen in public. The high status of Mongol women kind of alarmed some of the other peoples that the Mongols came into contact with. Ultimately, though, there will be an end of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire ultimately was too large and too diverse, really, for one power to rule over in perpetuity. Khanates had little contact with each other. There's five different khanates, and ultimately started to kind of govern themselves separately. And as they did that, you start to see division within the empire. The Mongols lacked also history and experience with governing. Each Khanate, as I said before, adopted the government traditions of their conquered people, more so as the centuries went by. And ultimately, they became more and more separate as a result of that. Leaders after Genghis and Kublai Khan were less effective as a result of that. Resentment against the Mongols started to grow in many of the conquered lands over time. And by the 1400s, the Russian people united under a powerful czar or leader to drive out the Mongols, Ivan. Chinese discontent with Mongol rule led to uprisings and the eventual end of the Yuan Dynasty. The Mongol Empire did not decline and was not defeated. Instead, it fell apart as the Khans assimilated into the cultures of the conquered peoples. Cultural and technological diffusion in the post-classical age. You see all kinds of cultural diffusion by looking at this picture here. This is a Catholic church that was once a mosque that's utilizing Greco-Roman architecture and Muslim artistic sensibilities, and is located in Spain in Western Europe. Old and new trade routes. Throughout the post-classical age, cities all along the trade routes exchanged things like luxury goods, new technologies, religions, and culture.
Muslim communities in this area established trading cities all around the rim of the Indian Ocean, throughout the Middle East, into North Africa, Spain, and China as well. Jews and Christians lived in China, South Asia, Central Asia, and North Africa. Cultural diffusion was bound to happen. Chinese merchants lived in Southeast Asia and throughout the Indian Ocean as well as China itself. Persian merchants established communities all along the Silk Road from the Byzantine Empire to China, translating many religious texts while they were there. Diasporic communities, that means communities that had been dispersed from their homelands and transplanted other places. That's what a diaspora is. So communities of people that had been dispersed away from their homeland, like the Jews had been dispersed by the Romans back in the Roman Empire, were established all over for economic reasons, and they provided a great deal of cross-cultural insights for cooperating with governments. They are usually outsiders living among a group that share some kind of identity, whether it's ethnicity or religion or language, but they end up adapting to the ways. And this is another perfect example of cultural diffusion. Again, the Jews that were dispersed by the Roman Empire to live all throughout Europe, you end up having German Jews and Spanish Jews and French Jews and English Jews and Russian Jews. They adopt the culture of the area where they were dispersed to, and they adapt their own culture as part of it as well. New technologies from China, like gunpowder in particular, as well as the paper and the compass and the astrolabe, spread to Western Europe. Gunpowder will change the way warfare is done forever, and we'll talk more about the implications of gunpowder as we move into future units. India spread knowledge of how to grow cotton and how to grow sugar, and new types of rice emerged from Southeast Asia that would eventually be dispersed along the Silk Roads. We talked about that fast ripening rice, the champa rice from Vietnam, that will eventually be spread along the Silk Roads and eventually get to Western Europe. Indian mathematical concepts, numbers including 0, as you recall, spread throughout the Arab world, will eventually will be referred to as Arabic numerals. This was discussed in a previous unit as well as an example of cultural diffusion. Muslim scholars like Averroes preserved Greek literature and science, as we determined before. Religions, especially Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, spread and experienced syncretism. Remember, syncretism means blending with local conditions, or blending of two different kinds of religions together into a new thing. Land and sea merchants spread Islam into South and Southeast Asia from the Middle East. Islam, mixed with Hindu beliefs in India, will come to form what's known as Sufism, and Muslims saw Christians, Jews, and even Buddhists eventually as people of the book. Other examples of cultural diffusion. Christianity incorporated Roman polytheistic beliefs like the veneration of saints who intervene on a believer's behalf. They also adopt a lot of Roman holidays and rename them Christian holidays. The winter solstice is celebrated by the Roman pagans, and eventually it will be incorporated to become part of our Christmas celebrations for the birth of Christ. Mahayana Buddhism incorporated belief in salvation and eternal life, which was more popular than the original version called Theravada Buddhism. Most likely, those Buddhists had come into contact with other mystery religions, maybe even Christianity. Languages. For example, Bantu-based languages in Africa will spread to southern and eastern Africa and become what's known as Swahili, which is a blending of the local language and the Arabic, as the Arabs come and take over parts of Africa. Latin-based or Romance languages, French and Spanish, are examples, diffused across Western Europe after the fall of Rome as well. We've discussed this in class as well. Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, Italian, all Romance languages. Arabic as a language was carried across North Africa and into West Africa through Muslim merchants, and is spoken still in these regions today. The travels of Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Long-distance travel was made much easier through unifying forces like the Pax Mongolia, remember, the Mongol peace, as well as the notion in the Islamic world of Dar al-Salam, the House of Islam. In 1274, Marco Polo, who was an Italian merchant, completed a long journey that led him eventually to the court of the Mongol leader Kublai Khan in China. Marco Polo will actually serve as a bureaucrat for Kublai Khan for the next 17 years before he returns home to Italy with goods from China. He produced eventually a written account of the sights, the people, and the events he encountered while in China in the service of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan. This diary or memoir of sorts became a bestseller in Europe and piqued a lot of people's interest to explore further. Eventually, we will have an age of exploration. Marco Polo will inspire generations of Europeans to connect to the outside world more so than they had ever done before, lead them to look outside of Europe to find direct trade routes to the east initially, as well as we will see, led to the exploration of the Americas and Africa as well. In 1325, another explorer, a Muslim explorer rather than a Christian explorer, Ibn Battuta was his name. He was a Muslim from Morocco in North Africa, began a journey that would last 44 years and ultimately cover 73,000 miles. That's a lot of territory for one individual. Eventually, his writings will influence others as well, much like Marco Polo's writings did. In his writings, he said, "I set out alone, having neither fellow traveler in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor a caravan whose part I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me, and a desire, long cherished in my bosom, to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit my dear ones, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests." Battuta visited Mecca, Constantinople, Mesopotamia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, southern China, Spain, and even the Kingdom of Mali in Africa. Ibn Battuta's journeys mostly were confined to Dar al-Islam, territories that were already Islamic, but a variety of people and cultures would be living there, so cultural diffusion was already part of these cultures when he arrived there. Ibn Battuta, as I said before, recorded his tales from his journey, and it became a popular book that provides historians today, even, with important insights into the post-classical world. The spread of the bubonic plague. Most of this is review from stuff that we have covered in previous units, but it still applies to this unit because the origin of the bubonic plague comes from Asia. The Black Death. Long-distance trade increased the spread of the disease and pathogens that led to the Black Death of the 1300s. In 1338, the bubonic plague originated in Mongolia, with victims developing black swellings or buboes, swollen lymph glands, caused by internal bleeding, and necrotized flesh. Fleas living on rodents, mostly rats, carried the disease and could infect humans if they were bitten by that flea after they had bitten the infected rat, although this was unknown to people at the time. Mongols spread the disease to China during their military campaigns, and merchants spread it westward along the Silk Road, and eventually the sea travel routes as well. Ibn Khaldun wrote, "Civilization in the East and West was visited by a destructive plague, which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out." Mongols laid siege to the Black Sea port of Kaffa that was controlled by the Italians from Genoa, and threw infected bodies over the walls with catapults to defeat the city. In 1346, some Genoese sailors escaped and returned to Italy, introducing disease to Europe. From the Red Sea, the plague reached Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Egypt, and from China, the plague was introduced to India. The plague typically killed 70% of urban populations. Remember, that is the cities, because people lived in closer proximity to one another. And it also killed about 25% of the populations of Europe, China, and Egypt. More if you ask some historians. Some historians even say between 30 and 50%. So, we usually say a third to kind of round it. Many once thriving cities were devastated. Trade came to a near standstill as a result, and farming losses led to widespread famine. Famine before the plague also impacted the society and made people more susceptible to the plague when it hit because of them being malnourished. A great many breathed their last in the public streets day and night. A large number perished in their homes, and it was only by the stench of their decaying bodies that they proclaimed their deaths to their neighbors. Everywhere, the city was teeming with corpses. This was written in a diary of a citizen of Florence, Italy. Shortages of labor will eventually lead to social unrest and rebellions. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 and the Revolt of the Jacquerie in France in 1356 are both byproducts of this plague